Can everyone hear me? This is good. So thank you, Jacques, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for what has been such an invigorating 2 days. My political concept for you today is imperception. I've been thinking about this concept for some time now, and I feel a little self-conscious about trying to work out with you what this concept even is, as opposed to attempting to redefine a concept that we already think we're familiar with. In the spirit of my concept, imperception, allow me to slowly attempt to reveal what this term means, rather than providing a straight definition up front. Let me start with an example. Phyllis Wheatley Peters' collection of poems, poems on various subjects, religious and moral, was published in 1773. First appearing in London, the collection is perhaps best remembered today for the poem titled On Being Brought from Africa to America. It's certainly the most anthologized poem from that collection. Scholars of Wheatley Peters know to pay particular attention to her titles, especially for their oblique relation to the content of the poems themselves. For example, her poem titled To the University of Cambridge in New England is odd because the poem itself is directed to the students at Harvard, although the title might lead you to believe that the poem was more concerned with the institution itself. It's to the University of Cambridge in New England. This disjunction between the poem and its title asks us to think through how her critique of Harvard's students relates to larger institutional power. Think of it, a young, teenaged, enslaved Black girl who is absolutely excluded from any type of inclusion in these elite circles. She poetically positions herself in the morally superior position, instructing Harvard students on proper conduct. And so, although the poem speaks to a particular group of individuals, it also opens up onto a more capacious form of institutional critique. How might we characterize what I earlier said was a disjunction between the poem's title and its content? Let's return to that most famous poem, the one that I mentioned a moment ago, On Being Brought from Africa to America. We find a similar type of misdirection here. Upon reading the title, we might expect that a poem detailing the horrors of the Middle Passage would follow. Just like the Harvard poem, that's not what we find. Instead, Wheatley Peters' readers are presented with a succinct group of heroic couplets thanking her enslavers for bringing her to the colonies and teaching her about the Christian God. So I'll read the poem because it's pretty short. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." The Middle Passage, or at least a description of it, is a conspicuous absence in a poem that names that journey, but then refuses to talk about it with us. And at the same time that the poem points to its own gap, a gap that it is well aware of, it also ends on a note of chastisement, just like the Harvard poem. In other words, we might read these final two lines as against that conspicuous absence of the Middle Passage, as a commentary on the scenes of torture and dehumanization that are not depicted. Wheatley Peters' thankfulness is something of a misdirection, just like the title. A thankfulness that only becomes apparent when we think through the poem's central absence. So it's this absence that interests me. how writers make legible an otherwise imperceptible absence that their literary works are necessarily about. I want to say here that Wheatley Peters' poem thinks in economies of perception. And I don't really mean this metaphorically. We need only look ahead a few years to Olaudah Equiano, Wheatley Peters' contemporary, who in his 1789 Interesting Life of Equiano ties the process of modern racialization to the Middle Passage and American chattel slavery. The economic foundation of chattel slavery is rendered imperceptible in Wheatley Peters' poem. And by economic foundation, I mean the lives and labor of kidnapped and enslaved Africans upon which the system would depend. And in Wheatley Peters, this economic foundation is rendered imperceptible in order to make it legible. We should not be surprised that the core of economic production and of economic activity is rendered imperceptible. That is, we do not find it represented directly, but rather only indirectly, by looking askance at it through literary form. It is this relationship that I want to try to explore and define with you today. This relationship of imperception, or the relationship between literary form, sensory perception, and political economy. For the next 20 minutes or so, I'll consider how the senses have been historically conditioned by economics. How, that is, what we sense and how we sense is a product of the development of political economy. Ultimately, what I want to think about today is how the senses demarcate the limits of political possibility. What is imperceptible, in other words, is also unthinkable, which is exactly the problem that I think Wheatley Peters' poem articulates. So this is a question of how literature diagnoses social and political limitation, and how it critiques from its present the political and economic world from which it emerges. Part 1. Recall the familiar section of Capital, where Marx has us follow the capitalist into, quote, the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold there hangs the notice, no admittance except on business, end quote. In part, what Marx here suggests is that production is always hidden from view. But more specifically, Marx tells us that in the sphere of production, we shall see, he writes, not only how capital produces, but how capital is itself produced. The secret of profit-making must be laid bare, Marx writes. Notice how, for Marx, it is not just the process of production as such that is hidden, that is secretive. Rather, it is how capital is itself produced. At the core of Marx's concern is not the material goods that are the result of the process of production. Rather, it is how the specific relation that we call capital is produced. So, understanding the secret of profit-making is going to be more complicated than just taking a peek behind the curtain and seeing the workers at work. What I want to work out with you here today is how literature does not exactly try to make the invisible visible, to do something like reveal the conditions of production, but rather how it instead makes the imperceptible legible. I bring up this language of the visible and the invisible because we know very well what it looks like when we make the sphere of production visible. In fact, it's done all the time. We can see the stitching on our clothing, or we notice the imperfect sizing on our jeans, imperfections that bear the signs of a process of human labor. Or maybe we hear a charming story at the farmer's market from the person who grew the tomatoes that you're buying. And of course, there are any number of shows like How It's Made, I don't know if that's still on TV actually, where the cameras take a peek inside the factory, seemingly behind the curtain, obscuring the sphere of production. Aha, we say, production has been demystified. But all of these examples miss something essential, because it's not exactly that the process of labor itself is imperceptible. Rather, its value and the social nature of value that can be known but not sensed. As Marx writes in Capital, quote, "Not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodities as values. We may twist and turn a single commodity as we wish. It remains impossible to grasp as a thing possessing value," end quote. Value is not a physical, tangible thing. Rather, it is the expression of a social relation. That social relation can be known of. It can be intellectually understood, analyzed, critiqued, or ultimately expressed in the form of a price. But it cannot be sensed. As David Harvey writes, value is, quote, "a social relation. As such, it is, like gravity, an immaterial but objective force. I cannot dissect a shirt and find atoms of value in it any more than I can dissect a stone and find atoms of gravity. Both are immaterial relations that have objective material consequences," end quote. When we sense an apple falling from a tree, we are not sensing gravity. Rather, we are sensing the effect that gravity has on the apple. We might see gravity in action, but we do not see gravity itself. Similarly, when we notice the imperfections in the stitching on our clothing or watch a building being constructed, we are sensing labor and the signs of it, but not value itself. Value always remains fundamentally imperceptible. So, what I want to say, and where I'd like to take you with some of this thinking, is how the sensorium cannot sense sociality. And I think the sensorium cannot sense sociality because the concept of the social has been subsumed by capital under the sign of value. Let me stitch some of this together with Marx's earlier writing in the 1844 manuscripts. This is where Marx thinks through this direct relation, and where he writes that, quote, "The development of the five senses is a labor of the whole previous history of the world." So the senses have been developed alongside capital, and I take Marx quite literally here. When he says that the development of the senses is a labor, I take him to mean something similar to the opening of the 18th Brumaire, where, as we know, right, men make history, but they do not make it as they please. In other words, the capitalist mode of production produces material goods under the sign of the commodity form. It also produces a sensorium that is bound to, determined by, and developed with and alongside value under capital. So, in a world where our social relations appear as mere material relations, and here I again take Marx to be very deliberate in his emphasis on the appearance of commodity fetishism. In this world where our social relations appear as material relations, it is not a surprise that we do not know how to sense socially. Marx is really explicit on this point. He writes in the 1844 manuscripts, quote, "As music alone awakens man's musical sense, and the most beautiful music has no meaning for the unmusical ear. For this reason, the senses of social man differ from those of the unsocial." And to be clear, we are not today, nor have we ever been this social man. The senses have developed alongside capital to be profoundly antisocial. And just as my cat has no idea what music is when I put it on, other than just really loud noise, we similarly are unable to sense sociality. Part 2. Imperception, then, is our inability to sense and to make sense of the signs of sociality that are otherwise right in front of us. In particular, I'm interested in the central role of slavery in the development of the modern sensorium. Slavery was the economic foundation of the Atlantic world. And I think that we have to examine the character of capitalist production of a given period to think through the specificity of its development. So this is why earlier I asked us to think through how Wheatley Peters does not just expose or make visible the Middle Passage in her poem. Rather, she cites it in a rather indirect manner. And in so doing, she might not reveal the brutality of the journey, but she does make legible the imperceptible fault lines upon which the political imagination rests. And this is where I think the question of literariness is most crucial. How might literature demarcate the limits to political possibility? And how might literature help us come to an understanding of how and why the world appears to us as it does? As Jameson writes in Representing Capital, quote, "The form of appearance of a properly capitalist reality is neither true nor false, but simply real," end quote. The point for me isn't that literature cuts through illusion and gets us to the heart of the matter. Instead, I want to think about something more in line with Sian Nai's work, where in The Theory of the Gimmick, she writes, quote, "The appearance concealing the essence is part of that essence, entailed by and indispensable to it," end quote. The absence of the middle passage in Wheatley Peters' poem here becomes a way of refracting back to us the imperceptible economic core or essence, in Nai's words, of capitalist production. That transformation of human life into cargo is the basis on which Western sociality rests. And it is no surprise then that Wheatley Peters reveals to us how it is nevertheless ceaselessly hidden. What I hope is becoming clear is how this is a developmental moment in the history of sensing. And Wheatley Peters' refusal to directly represent the middle passage is just such an imperceptible refraction. It makes legible the economic relation that both defines Black life in the Americas and provides the grounds for the social sphere under capital as such. Imperception, in other words, is not something we ever come to an understanding of through representation. Imperception is profoundly anti-representational or non-representational. And this is because the sociality of value is similarly impossible to represent. And so my interest lies in texts that engage in their political thinking in just such an anti or non-representational mode. My interest lies in texts that resonate at the same frequency as the society that they critique. I want to look at one more of these anti-representational texts with you, a novel in this case. I'm jumping ahead here to the mid-19th century because I think this will help illuminate what I think are the political stakes at the heart of this concept of imperception. I turn here to Martin Delaney's only novel called Blake or the Huts of America. For those unfamiliar, I'll give you a little bit of background. Blake was serialized in two separate runs, first in 1859 and then from 1861 to 62. For those of you who don't know how the novel works, it's essentially a book about the fomenting of an international revolution to take down the system of slavery. The revolutionary force is led by a coalition of free and enslaved people of color in the US, Caribbean, Africa, and across the larger Black Atlantic as a whole. What's so strange about the novel, however, is that this revolution never happens. Part of this might just be a historical oddity. The last few chapters of the novel are missing. So the final extant chapter brings us right up until it seems like a violent revolution is about to break out in Cuba. But then the novel ends abruptly. And so we're in effect left in this state of suspense, unknowing of how things would have come to pass. I'm interested in Blake in how the text essentially refuses to bring into representation the revolution that it is otherwise centrally about. It's worth mentioning here that Blake was published in Black-run magazines that were especially known for their eclectic offerings. In fact, Delaney published articles on Haiti in the exact same venues. There isn't, in short, some historical concern over censorship or palatability of such a depiction of revolution. Readers probably would have loved to see the revolution represented. But the novel refuses to bring that revolution into positive representation. And the text toys with its reader throughout, consciously concealing the plans for revolution at one moment and cutting short a mutiny of enslaved people on a slave ship in the Middle Passage at another. We'll look at that in a second. The text, in other words, plays with the reader's desire for a positive representation of revolution. It constantly snatches away that satisfaction as it dangles it right in front of you. And ultimately, the ending, or lack of an ending, only reinforces this point. I want to think about with you why this novel gets at something central about imperception. The novel's refusal to depict Black revolution, as I understand it, is a way of commenting on the imperceptibility of Black social life in the 19th century. I understand this as a way of thinking through a fundamental limitation imposed by capital that always regulates Black social and political life to the historical back burner, to quote Michel Rolfe-Trouillot on the Haitian Revolution. And so this is what I think the novel helps us diagnose about the foundations of political perception, and helps us consider how perception in modernity is intertwined with white supremacy. This is something that the novel models with a number of its white characters. I'm thinking here of that scene that I mentioned earlier that takes place on a slave ship traversing the Middle Passage. The Africans in the hold of the ship break free of their chains, and they arm themselves with weapons, and they're prepared to kill their kidnappers and take command of the ship. That's sort of the height of this scene. But what happens at this moment, the captain goes, he looks below deck to find out what's been going on. And the scene it's really wild. He kind of like opens a door, looks, and all he sees is that the Africans have opened up some barrels of food and have started eating and drinking the supplies on the ship. He can't, in other words, make sense of what is happening right in front of his eyes. He completely misapprehends expressions of Black sociality precisely because he cannot conceptualize Black people as political and social beings. It's not a surprise that this scene happens while the ship is traversing the Middle Passage. And it's also not surprising that the mechanisms of white perception render Black political and social action only in terms of consumption. The white sensorium is not prepared to make sense of Black sociality. But it is also worth saying here that Delaney identifies in a similar manner within the context the ways that characters of color throughout the novel also run up against similar barriers. And I bring this up just to sort of mention because this text, it sort of fits into this tradition of uplift and consciousness raising. It's got a sort of, in a lot of ways, a sort of like direct political goal. And so between the way that the novel deals with characterization, with form, with narrative, Delaney brings his reader up to this epistemic limit to the political imagination by making legible the impossibility of sensing, perceiving, and imagining Black sociality within the limits of capital. Black life is so intertwined with labor and economics, Delaney wants to say, that the revolution is beyond the capabilities of both the Black and white political imagination. Just as the centrality of Black labor and Black life to the world economy is rendered imperceptible, so too is the possibility of a social formation that would figure things differently. And so this is where I sort of want to leave you today on this note. And in this way, let me just point to one more moment from this period in the middle of the 19th century that helps us think about the profoundly anti-representational work of early African American literature. Consider for a moment how William Wells Brown, the author of Clotel or the President's Daughter, characterized this problematic in a lecture delivered to the Female Anti-Slavery Society of Salem in 1847. Here, Brown says, quote, "I may try to represent to you slavery as it is. Another may follow me and try to represent the condition of the slave. We may all represent it as we think it is, and yet we shall all fail to represent the real condition of the slave. Your fastidiousness would not allow me to do it. And if it would, I, for one, should not be willing to do it, at least to an audience. Were I about to tell you the evils of slavery, to represent to you the slave in his lowest degradation, I should wish to take you one at a time and whisper it to you. Slavery has never been represented. Slavery can never be represented." Wells Brown reflects on the role that representation can or should play in attempting to say something about slavery. In some ways, I think Wells Brown here anticipates a lot of what Hartman and Moten will get into later on by asking us to consider the politics of representation. And Wells Brown sort of urges us to think about what it means for literary forms of expression to presume to capture slavery's degradation. Is any of this possible in a public forum? Wells Brown asks. How are people's interest in the specifics of brutalization tied to a larger understanding of the apparatic nature of slavery, of the Middle Passage, to sort of point back to Rollins' talk yesterday? How might early African American literature take up this proposition as its central problematic, this impossibility of representation, I mean? And how might Delaney's and Wheatley Peters' interventions suggest that these limits to representation have both developed alongside and undergirded the perceptual mechanisms of a form of capital based on economies of enslaved labor? We might read the early African American novel in these terms specifically: the Baroque and experimental style, the dropped plot lines, the disappearing characters, and the seemingly disconnected snapshots of enslaved life that characterize both Clotel and Blake. How might all of these attempts to make legible the fundamental unrepresentability of slavery, the impossibility of capturing and representing through literary form the enormity of slavery, the Middle Passage, just as they make legible the imperceptibility of Black social life as defined under capital? In my understanding and in closing, I want to suggest that Delaney and Wheatley Peters give us the tools to learn to read how perception has been conditioned under capital. And they give us these tools precisely because they tie their investigations of the imperceptible nature of slavery and the Middle Passage to the intertwinement of Black social life with political economy. So while they may not present us with an object to study, which is exactly what Wells Brown warns against, they give us a literary method that has grown up alongside the development of the senses within the context of racial capitalism. Thank you.